Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink, I actually have a bottle of, but not the original bottle. Today's ink was provided by the wonderful, mysterious Benefactor, and it's Dromgoole's exclusive by Noodler's, Alamo's Twilight. Now, of course, this is not the box it came in, and this is not the bottle that generally comes in. But, yeah, as you can see, maybe in the bottle, but, yeah, it's a very pleasant brown. It really kind of evokes chestnuts for me. But, yeah. So, the two pens that I used were these. They're both Hero 616s. One is just, you know, a standard unaltered fine nib. And the other is one that I tinkered with. It's been broadened, and I don't know if you'll be able to see, but the tines have been spread just a little bit, so it's a bit more wet, which might not have been the wisest decision, as we'll see later. Oh my god, every week I forget my pointy thing. Anyways, let's check out the chromatography, which is fascinating. Yeah, as you can see, there's definitely some potential for permanence here. There's a very clear dot where my dogs are angry, where the ink was initially put down. It's a very sort of simple brown, but with hints of red. You can see where it's being pushed up. And then you get into like this orange and then sort of a yellow here at the corners. Now, here's where I let it dry, and you might be able to tell a slight difference. The dot got much darker. It kind of resisted being pushed up a bit, but what's sort of here in the middle is just a bit lighter, and there's no orange really. There's sort of this muddy brown band, and then this bright highlighter pink, yellow. That is not the camera messing with you guys. This is highlighter yellow, and actually it fluoresces under black light, but judging by how well that went last week, I'm not going to try it again. God, my dogs are really angry. So I thought I'd try and compare it to a few other inks that I had. So here's Alamo's Twilight. And here's Noodler's Nightshade, if I can get the card here, which on certain websites is actually under purple, but mine was profoundly brown. So yeah, also Graf von Faber-Castell's Hazelnut Brown, which as you can see is very similar. This one maybe shades a bit more. Noodler's Brown, which maybe has a little less red in it. It might be just a teeny bit darker. And then I thought I'd throw in Mont Blanc's Coffee Brown, but as you can see, it's got a bit more orange in it, in the lighter parts, and it might shade a bit more. But I haven't tested that one yet, so we shall see. Now, on to the paper test. Top down in density, Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Hold this still so you can get a good look. Yeah, nice shading, right? And it's a lovely brown. I know a few people were expecting this to be more of a red. I wasn't really. My like everything has always been kind of the same color. It's a brown with some red undertones, and what's interesting is when it first goes on, it's much more red, and then the longer it dries and sort of the longer it sits on the paper, the more brown it gets. So, but yeah, the fine took 6 seconds. The broad and wet one took 19. I feel like you can really get a nice look at that shading. And this was well behaved in that there was no bleed, no feather, no spread, no sheen. I don't think there was really any echo. I didn't see any, and there still isn't any, so I'm going to go with no. But it is fairly wet all on its own. This ink for me was flowing at about a 7. It was like a horse ready to get out of the gate. It wanted to go. But yeah, here's the water test. As you can see, a lot of this remained. It gets a lot lighter, at least the fine did, that broad. Well, you know, the more ink you put down, the more there is to wash away, and the more there is to remain, and that's kind of what happened. But yeah, as you can see, it's very well behaved. It didn't feather, didn't explode. It did dye the page, but what's there is very clear, very dark, very recoverable. If you had to recover that, you could. Next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter, where again, it looks really good and it behaved really well, unless we get to just the side of the paper where there's some misbehaving, which was what clued me in that this was probably from the bottom of the stack. Overall though, no bleed, no real feather except for environmental causes. Someday I will explain why that happens, but today is not a paper lecture day. So yeah, great shading. Again, you have this lovely, lovely brown, but there's this red undertone, this noticeable red undertone. The fine took 9 seconds to dry, which seemed like a bit of a leap from 6, but the broad and wet took 23. This is a very saturated ink. There's a lot of ink in this ink. Why are my dogs freaking out? You can see in the smear, that's very solid color. You know, there's no thinness to that. So there's a lot of stuff in this ink. So it makes sense that it takes longer to dry. But yeah, so no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo even. I mean, maybe in the broad. No, I'm not seeing it. But anyways, no sheen. All good in that regard. Now this water test is fantastic. For some reason, this T and this W looks like they were starting to feather a little bit, but as you can see, it's very clear, very there. It did dye the page a bit of that red-brown, but if you had to recover that, you absolutely could. Next up is Tomoe River paper. I started testing this before incorporating Fabriano, but yeah, I hope we'll get this on camera because it's really kind of amazing. There's a sheen, at least I'm pretty sure that's what it is. It's in the oh, there we go. See that gold flash in the scrubby? Now what's weird about this is it is such a bright yellow kind of a gold sheen that actually what it evokes is more of this color. So I don't know if it's a sheen or something weird with the ink separate, but it's gorgeous. And I really like this sort of gradient effect, this sort of soft shading that we see. It's not as like, you know, cut and dry, like light, dark. So that's nice. Now this paper, Tomoe River, is known for drawing out dry times, and boy did it, to the point where I had to stop counting. It took, after counting about a minute, usually I stop counting after 30 seconds, but after a minute I just stopped counting. And I got really frustrated with it, and as you can probably tell, there are little smudges all over because it just never seemed to dry. And at one point I had waited 5 minutes and this was still smearing. And so that was a bit of a problem. But again, this is a very saturated ink. There's a lot of stuff in it. The broad itself was already a bit wet. The flow for this ink itself was a bit wet. There was some problems. And so the dry times were just driving me nuts. And the thing is, it took this fine more than a minute to dry. So, I mean, that's not what you want to see, and it was very frustrating, and it was disappointing because I'm really enjoying this brown, and I love that it has permanence, and I really enjoyed the shading, and it's even got this bright gold sheen, but the dry times were just killing me. Now, I don't know if the camera's actually going to let you pick this up, but there's actually some noticeable echo. And also, I don't know if the camera will let you pick, there we go. See that bright yellow? I had actually started to scratch through the page. I caught the inside of the tines on the nib, and so it scratched through the page, and that highlighter yellow came through the back, which is kind of nuts. But anyways, this paper loves to let ink slide away when you add more water. And actually, it didn't do too much of that here. The fine did get a good bit lighter, but it's still there. It's still very clear, very dark, or fairly dark. It didn't feather, it didn't explode, it did dye the page, but it's readable. If you had to recover that, you could. Now for the next 3 tests, I just used the fine, except to write the name where I used the broad. Now here is some just god-awful 20-pound copier paper. Really crappy stuff, like the stuff you can buy in pharmacies. Yeah, it took 1.5 seconds to dry. It's a very nice brown. You lose a lot of that red undertone. There's no shading left. But honestly, it didn't feather and explode as much as we often see. There is some feathering. I really wish I had my pointy thing right now, but you know, it's like in the ease. It's sort of like a softness to it. There isn't a ton of spread. There is some, but it's not as awful as we usually see. But there is some bleed, because this is a fairly wet flowing ink. You see that? And like we've got little dots. Nothing rendered onto the page below except the broad, and I wish this would come up on camera. A lot of what's coming through is that highlighter yellow, which is kind of fascinating. But yeah, there's a lot of show through. There's some very near bleed. I guess we could kind of call that bleed, but it's the scrubby. But yeah, it could have been a lot worse. That was the thing that kind of surprised me. I was expecting a lot worse from this ink. Now, this water test is really something else. What's at the center of it, where the writing was, is very clear and very there. But there is a very dark puddle halo thing around it, much darker than what we saw on the previous tests. So, yeah, it's not going to stand out as much as it did here, but if you had to recover that, you could. In many regards, it's fairly well behaved. Didn't feather, didn't explode, didn't get unreadable. Now, next up is Mead Notebook Paper, which is physically thinner than 20-pound copier paper, but generally tends to outperform it. However, this time, I'm not sure I can say that. The spread is just as much. I'd say there's even more noticeable feathering on here. Really wish I had my pointy thing. It's very woolly. It took slightly longer to dry, but that's actually common because of just how absorbent this 20-pound copier paper is. And I just knocked my camera. Yeah, there's a lot of show-through, as you can tell. But, I mean, this is much thinner paper, and this is a fairly wet flowing ink, but also, if you can see, there's not as much very near fully all the way through bleed through like we see here with the dots. So, could have been a heck of a lot worse. Now, this paper absolutely hates water. So, a lot of times when we do the water test, like, the writing will start to just, like, explode and do crazy, crazy stuff. Here, not so much. It also didn't dye the page as much as it did with the 20-pound paper. That was kind of nuts. But yeah, as you can see, what's at the center, it didn't feather, it didn't explode. There's not as much contrast, but as there was without the water test. But again, if you had to recover that, you could. Yeah. Now, lastly is Moleskine notebook paper. And I hate this paper. I really, really hate it. It hates ink. But what are you going to do? Now, the dry times were 4.5 seconds, which I can't explain, because when we actually look at the paper, oh, God, you see that scrubby? See how woolly that is? God, I got so frustrated with it that I actually wrote this top line in the broad just because I hate accurate Moleskine paper. But yeah, I hope this will come through. It's agonizingly feathery. It's really woolly. There's some spread. Like, it spread more than it did on the other two papers. There's no shading. It's gross looking. I mean, it's not a flattering color. And even with the bright light coming in this direction, you can see, I mean, you can practically read this from the back. And this rendered onto the page below in multiple places and not just where I was writing with the broad. But again, I hope this comes through. What came through in the broad, part of it is that highlighter color. So, and also in the back of the water test. But yeah. Speaking of water tests, despite every other water test being mostly legible, this one not so much. I mean, what's at the center feathered and exploded. It definitely dyed the page. It got, like, intensely woolly. It's just hideous looking, to be honest. Yeah, so there you go. There's Noodlers for Dromgoole's Alamo Twilight. It's a lovely brown. I would say that it's permanent or semi-permanent. Again, I don't have the original bottle, so I don't know what it would say on it. But it is slightly wet. It, go easy on cheap papers. Be careful on Tomoe River. It just never seems to dry. But it looks absolutely lovely on Rhodia and Clairefontaine. If you have this ink, I'd really like to know your experiences with it. If you could leave a comment down below, just your sense of it, anything you think might be pertinent, because yeah, I'm just curious about it. Let me know if you've had any different results. But yeah, for your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching. Bye.